So while the Balance Dataslate has brought some cool buffs to Guard and Marines, let's focus on the armies that haven't been quite so lucky. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're continuing in our discussion of the seismic changes to 40k that the Balance Dataslate has brought. So far we've taken a bit more of an in-depth look at Armour of Contempt and the Guard buffs, but I thought it would be worth a video to look at the armies that came off with the short end of the stick and where it leaves them in 40k right now. Overall, throughout Games Workshop's updates, there have really been more nerfs than there have buffs. The major two to the core rules are Bodyguard abilities getting burnt down, Indirect Fire being heavily taken down a peg besides against Guard, faction-specific stuff against things like Custodes, Tau, Harlequins, and both Imperial and Chaos Knights via a mission, and then a fair few mid-tier factions that were untouched, despite armies that are about their same sort of level like Marines getting a massive buff. In this video I thought we'd talk through them one by one, go through the faction-specific, go through the major changes to Custodes, Tau and Harlequins first, then look through Orks, Necrons and some of the rest. First up, I thought we'd start with Custodes, as they certainly seem to be one of the armies that people have had the strongest reaction to online against the nerfs. It seems like quite a few people thinking they were toned down too much. I must admit I might be going against the grain a bit here. I don't think Custodes are going to be in a particularly bad spot after the changes, though admittedly I think they will be losing their top tier status and will be a bit behind Tau and Harlequins. The Custodes saw 3 major nerfs. Obsec is only on troops units now, so you lose it on things like shield captains, Custodian Wardens, Terminators, and the Ventari. Though in general quite a lot of lists did tend to use a fairly decent amount of troops, Custodian Guard were really good, and they still are. There's some lists that have won tournaments that were basically nothing but Custodian troop spam, using hefty amounts of Sagittarium Guard. I feel it probably is going to be worth a few victory points in a good few close games, though the Custodians I still think aren't particularly bad on objectives. They can do heroic interventions to push enemies off them. Their troops are durable and powerful, and they do still have that rule for their models counting as multiple models on objectives, so they're often still going to win the numbers game if your opponent doesn't have OBSEC themselves. Otherwise, the rest of the nerfs all fell on stratagems. 3 really quite important stratagems are now 1 use only: the Emperor's Auspice for turning off enemy rerolls, Martial Discretion to change a Martial Qatar on a unit, and Esteemed Amalgam, the Emperor's Chosen One, to jump into another shield company's traits. All of these are really quite powerful staples that will be used multiple times in a game in a lot of Custodes armies, so this one's definitely a bit of a hit. You'll still get to use them all once per game though, so maybe overall you might be losing 1 or 2 uses of each of these throughout of a game. You'll still have it there for when it matters most. The command points aren't going to be wasted as well, they will be spent elsewhere on something else, so you're not trading out these stratagems for nothing. Finally, and a nerf to the bikes, 2 of the stratagems are now infantry only: Arcane Genetic Alchemy, the Custodes Transhuman, and the Emperor's Auspice, the one to turn off rerolls. Neither can be used on the Virtus Praetors anymore. It means that the bikes just aren't going to be quite as tanky workhorses for the army as they were, maybe filling in a bit more into the actual fast attack role as opposed to things that can both do fast attack and tank shots really well for a turn. As well as that, Armour of Contempt will hit auric weapons as well. AP-1 is not going to be as relevant against Space Marines, so that won't help when you're fighting one of the other power armoured armies. I'd say perhaps out of Custodes' list, the worst affected units are going to be Virtus Praetors and Custodian Wardens. The bikes definitely lose a fair bit of stratagem support, but I still think that the raw stats are really quite good. Fast and tanky, and decent damage dealing at range and in combat, and they are one of the units that didn't really care about the OBSEC change as they didn't have it to start with. I feel like they're still going to get played in Custodes armies, but maybe only in 1 or 2 units of 3, rather than the 3 units of 3 that often seem to crop up in Emperor's Chosen lists. Otherwise, I don't really see Custodian Wardens being taken very much now. They lost objective secured and their bodyguard ability was nerfed, so in general I really wouldn't be too surprised to see troops just run instead. I feel like overall, after the changes, I feel like we're going to see more Custodian Guard, more Forge World Dreadnoughts, and the very undercosted Trajan Valoris will still be making appearances in lists, though I guess he won't be securing objectives all by himself quite as easily. Overall, they're definitely weaker than before, but I still feel that they're probably going to be more powerful than the majority of codexes. I think between these nerfs and the Armour of Contempt changes, they actually might be a lot more on the same level as things like Space Marines, Grey Knights, or Death Guard, mid-tier to strong armies that can still do well at tournaments. While the shooting of their auric weapons might not be so good, I do feel they're quite well placed for cutting through the new Armour of Contempt with decent AP and damage too. It does feel like the sort of weapons that you're going to want in droves against the new Marines. Lore-wise, I can see why Custodes players are a little bit disappointed about not having Armour of Contempt themselves. After all, they are the Emperor's own super special Space Marines, so it feels weird for power armoured units to get a buff that they don't have. I guess you could definitely argue that they should have it and the points cost should just reflect that. That would probably be ideal. But I think if Games Workshop had just applied that buff to them without any points cost changes or anything, then Custodes would just remain massively head and shoulders above all the other power armoured factions. And I don't really think that that's very good for game balance for either Custodes players themselves or the rest of 40k. I guess we'll see how they get on in tournaments, hopefully still meeting with some success, without being quite so clearly superior to a number of other armies. Next up we have Harlequins, which did seem to be easily the game's strongest faction before the changes, and I would argue probably received the hardest nerfs to reflect that. The biggest one was to the Voidweaver spam going from 90 points to 130 points, definitely one of the game's most undercosted units, and Games Workshop came down very hard. That's an enormous 40-point nerf, or plus 44% points cost. It's one of the harshest points cost adjustments in most of 40k's recent history. I'd actually say it's probably gone to the point where the Voidweavers are one of the worst datasheets out of the Harlequins limited selection. Still probably going to be worth running a few, just as they actually give you some range in the army, but they're going to feel like a bit more of an expensive luxury pick, and not something that you want to just spam 9 of. Starweavers got a much more restrained nerf, going from 80 to 90 points, so plus 18% there. Still very usable, and a slight bit more of a luxury. I think perhaps a good nerf for the faction overall, as they are still going to be played, and that is going to cost Harlequins lists some points. Then the other two big nerfs were to Mirror Architect, now just affecting one core unit, so Voidweavers can't partake, and it's limited to just one unit, so you're not going to be able to protect an entire castle with it. Again, Shadowseers are still likely to see a lot of play, and it certainly tones down one of their most annoying bits of defense. And finally they stopped the favour of Segarak Death Jester combo, the one that allowed you to basically get an automatic 3 extra hits every time that you fired. He was pretty much in auto-take territory for every single Harlequins list, so having that particular build broken is definitely another nerf, even if Death Jesters still remain pretty strong. By comparison, it certainly makes things like Troops without Starweavers, Skyweaver jet bikes, and Troop Masters and Solitaires just a little bit more tempting for the Harlequins. I was kind of expecting something to nerf the Light Sadath a bit. It has been the one that's been seeing far more play, but I guess it kind of has been toned down a bit with Voidweavers getting hit so hard. They are kind of the best unit with it. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a few more lists using either Dark or Twilight, both of which are also good. Maybe a few more people might be tempted to more run a Craftworld list with Harlequin allies again. That does seem another decent way of having a very strong contingent of Harlequins, but also have more fire support options. Overall, I'd still probably estimate the Harlequins to be a strong codex. Troops and Starweavers are still really good, and the Skyweaver jet bikes are still fine. I think it was mainly a case of being overshadowed by the options that were clearly much better. Again, I guess we'll see how they get on. I still think that they'll probably be a bit stronger than Custodes, but maybe only because they were head and shoulders above just about everything before. Certainly seeing 9 Voidweavers on the other side of the table, I don't think will be something that's missed by many. Finally, of the big three that attracted the majority of the nerfs are the Tau Empire. Again, perhaps prior to the nerfs, somewhere on the same sort of level as Custodes, probably a bit behind Harlequins, and have also taken some pretty major hits. I'd say the single biggest thing isn't actually one of their direct nerfs, it's the indirect fire change. The air-bursting fragmentation projectors and the smart missiles just gave them an enormous amount of hitting power to things that they couldn't see. A lot of armies just flat up died if they went against them. Anything with slightly fragile and hard-hitting light infantry that wanted to hide, things like Craft Worlds or Genestealer Corps maybe, both of these would pretty much just get hoovered off the table by Tau. The indirect fire nerf really does affect these both very badly. They're both pretty low AP weapons, so getting +1 save against them hurts, and also -1 to hit is really nasty against Tau with a native ballistic skill of 4+, meaning that if you can't get a marker light on your target, you're going to be doing a third less damage from that alone. In general, they aren't just fairly anti-everything hoovers, they're really going to be focused on just light infantry, and seem a bit more balanced for that role. Maybe not something that draws you to a unit quite as much as it used to. Still useful to have around though for plinking off the last few light infantry on a crucial objective though perhaps. Otherwise, the bodyguard rule was quite a big nerf to the Crisis bodyguards. They now seem really quite overcosted compared with the standard Crisis suits. 5 points per model just isn't going to be worth a slight increase in Lookout Sir ability. And then we get into the faction specific stuff. Modcar loses the bonus AP, it just gives you reroll 1s to wound now. Bad news for anything like pulse weapons, flamers or burst cannons. And it's really not so great now Marines have Armour of Contempt. It does mean that that buff's going to be a bit more efficient against Tau Montcar. Montcar's still great though I think. It still ups your damage, and it gives you massive mobility, so I think it's still going to see more play than Kauyon on average. Otherwise, Broadsides lose core, so several commander buffs, warlord traits and stratagems are just no longer options for them, though as a pure gunline unit I still think they're fine enough. You don't need to invest in them as much anymore. With heavy rail rifles and maybe some plasma rifles, they're still going to be quite happy to sit at the back and delete anything that they can see. Then Farsight Enclaves was really taken down a peg. The range dropped to 9 inches for their marker light buff. It's really bad for deep striking units which won't be able to make use of it now, though their stratagem's still powerful. And then just a minor, if slightly cheesy thing, that the minus 2-inch charge stratagems now don't stack with other things, so they aren't going to be as bad for units trying to charge Tau units while they're in woods. They won't be taking a massive minus 4 penalty. Overall, it's really quite a hefty amount of nerfs to be hitting Tau all at once. Probably the biggest losers are the Crisis Bodyguards, who both liked the character protection and air bursts. The broadside battlesuits won't appreciate the loss of core and their smart missiles being so much worse. I feel like heavy rail rifles and plasma rifles could be the way to go on those, particularly with Marines not liking the high AP and damage 3 of plasma. Also, anything that was aggressive in Farsight Enclaves has taken a double blow. Both Montcar and their Markerlight ranges are going to be a bit worse. I'd say maybe better choices by comparison are probably going to be the Tau Sept lists or maybe Borkhan. There was a fair spread of people playing both Tau Sept and Farsight before. I think that now more people are going to be playing Tau than Farsight, as they weren't nerfed as badly. Besides airburst and close-range Montcar, it doesn't really seem to have done all that much to mass crisis suits. I feel like instead of airburst, we're going to see a lot more cyclic ion blasters and plasma rifle suits. They're still great direct damage and get access to a whole load of buffs. Again, the high AP of plasma rifles is going to be great against Armour of Contempt. Finally, Hammerheads and Storm Surges are looking a bit better against broadsides. They didn't really lose very much from this update. Broadsides got nerfed, and they're still bringing some truly massive firepower. Overall, again with the top factions, I do feel that they're going to remain solid, particularly the builds that centre around crisis suits and some gunline support. They're just maybe going to take a little bit more thought to use now. You can't just delete things quite as easily with a bunch of ignores line of sight stuff, and the pretty crazy damage output of the faction has just had the edge taken off slightly, perhaps not towering over the competition quite so badly. Next up, I think one of the armies that's taken a fair few indirect nerfs is Orks. Before the Dataslate, maybe a bit more of a mid-tier faction in 40k, either building around vehicle lists with speed bomb or freebooters, or goth melee. They'd already taken some key nerfs in chapter approved, and boggy spam had been limited on the previous Dataslate, so seemed fairly in line with a fair bit of the rest of the field. I think Orks in particular are really not going to enjoy fighting Armour of Contempt. It's going to hurt anything with a chopper, ignoring AP-1 on Space Marines, and Orks have a fair bit of AP-2 shooting, things like the scrapjet rockets, or firepower from the Was bomb or the Dakar jets, depending on whether you're in Speed War, and I think they're going to find Marines kind of problematic. The indirect fire change also hurt squig buggies really quite a lot. Since the Codex came out, the Rocketron squig buggies were sort of overpowered, then got nerfed with limited numbers and a points buff, so they're kind of okay but limited, and now I'd argue that for the 110 points, they really are fairly bad. Getting -1 to hit when you hit on 4s is a massive loss in damage output. They're not going to enjoy fighting the new guard either. Low AP Hammer of the Emperor getting auto wounds is going to go through their bad saves. In particular, boys are looking really bad against lasguns now. Though I guess it's not all bad news. Some of the nerfs to the top armies will help them out a bit against things like Custodes, Tau and Harlequins. I feel like they probably could have used some things. A bunch of Ork units just aren't really very good at the moment. Something to help out standard boys wouldn't have gone too far amiss. Maybe doing something to help with their morale. With Armour of Contempt changes, maybe we might see a few more mech guns with custom mega cannons thrown into the mix, but overall I do feel that Orks might be one of the weaker armies in 40k in general, just due to a whole load of their competition getting decent buffs from Armour of Contempt and Hammer of the Emperor for the guard. In a very similar boat we have Necrons, in a rough spot throughout most of 9th edition, then got a fair amount of buffs with a lot of units gaining core, and a fair few quite decent points drops in chapter approved. Scorpec Destroyers, Flayed Ones and Locust Heavies all being pretty good. It was actually kind of turning a corner for the Necrons, seeing a little bit more recent tournament success compared with the top factions, and I probably would have got to the point where I was actually rating them on a fairly similar level to standard Space Marines before the Dataslate, something that I wouldn't have been saying for most of 9th edition. Now though, they're in an annoying spot where Space Marines, who are kind of on a similar level, haven't really got a massive buff with Armour of Contempt, and Necrons often being a slightly lower damage dealing and more durable faction, really get hurt by a fair few weapons here. Anything with AP-1 and AP-2 gets hit, so things like Flayed Ones, Gauss Flares and Reapers, or Wraith Claws. None of those are going to enjoy fighting off against power armor. Again, nerfs to other things don't really hurt too much. Bodyguard shenanigans, indirect fire, and the top army nerfs have all helped them out a bit against those matchups, but they still seem to be in a point where they're probably worse than Tau Custodes or Harlequins, and now also just about everything with power armor as well. After the changes, I feel like Scorpec destroyers might be a more important choice than ever. High AP, multiple damage attacks to chew through armor of contempt, and maybe you could say the same of the very high AP of the Locust heavy destroyers. Again with Orks, probably one of the weaker factions in 40k now once more. Similar power armies got big buffs, and they did not. Otherwise, just to run fairly rapid fire through some of the other factions, arguably Imperial and Chaos Knights are some of the very biggest losers out of the whole datasheet. For some reason, Games Workshop decided to take away Towering Foe and their OBSEC armigers temporarily. That's the change that they got in the previous Balance Dataslates, but as this one invalidates those and the Knight changes weren't present, technically they've lost the rule until presumably they get it back in their codex. In the meantime, and with the Guard and Chaos Marine buffs, Knights are probably the single weakest army in the entirety of 40k, really not going to be able to do anything with missions well. To be honest, I think in more casual games, I'd just say that the Knight player is probably just allowed to keep on using this rule. It seems like they've probably only removed it just because the new codexes are coming out, and they don't want something on the Balance Dataslate that reads differently to the actual codex rules. Certainly doesn't feel like an intentional balance change, and in any case it'll be overwritten soon when their codexes drop. Otherwise, perhaps one of the other notable things for the Knights was a bit of a nerf to those Ironstorm missile pods, a bit of an auto-include carapace weapon on Questoris patterns. They won't like being -1 to hit and also effectively losing AP. For AdMech, some of their shooting is not going to get on with Armor of Contempt. Mass AP -1 fire like standard Rangers won't enjoy fighting Space Marines, and also they've taken a similar and fairly unnecessary nerf to the Scorpius disintegrators with the energy cannons. Currently, I'd argue that they're really quite a well-balanced source of Ignor's line-of-sight firepower. You pay a premium for some slightly lower damage output, but they do remain usable. Now they're going to be -1 to hits and -1 AP when they're targeting something out of line of sight. I think that they're not really usable that much. I probably rate the Ferromite Cannon as the stronger choice now. For the Genestealer cult, I think maybe it's a mixed bag. They'll really quite like the Ignor's line of sight shooting changes. It can potentially hurt their guerrilla warfare if you're able to directly fire at their troops anyway. Having Tau have to work a bit harder to hoover up their fragile units isn't the worst thing. Again, big damage nerfs against new Marines, so they're going to be struggling against a lot of codexes they wouldn't have been. AP -2 Acolytes aren't going to be quite as effective, but I guess at least with the bodyguard changes, they're one of the better factions at protecting characters now. Maybe it's not too different for Drakari. Lancers and Poison won't be too bad against Armor of Contempt, and lots of factions massing very high AP weapons to chew through power armor won't hurt too much against them. Might be one of the winners overall, with some of the top factions nerfed. And then we have Demons, maybe vying again with Knights for one of the worst factions in 40k. Perhaps the other army that I might have expected to get buffs if Guard, Chaos Marines, and all the rest of the Space Marines did, as they're one of the ones that seem to be about the same sort of level as Guard and Chaos. At least outside maybe their very niche good builds with like Bellicor and Mask Keeper of Secrets. I think they really could have used something to help them out, though again I guess lots of armies massing lots of high AP weapons isn't the worst. They really won't enjoy fighting against the new Guard though. Hammer of the Emperor is really going to annoy them, never mind the fact that you can stack that with Vengeance for Cadia. Overall, out of the very biggest losers, I'd say maybe worst hit are Imperial and Chaos Knights, bad with missions and arguably one of the bottom tier codexes, and probably Custodes as well, a decent power nerf, but I still think probably remaining upper mid tier. I guess we'll see how well they get on against the Armor of Contempt Marines. Otherwise, I feel like Tau and Harlequins have also been nerfed, but maybe not quite as badly as the Custodes. Perhaps similar strength, and maybe still a tiny bit stronger than most of the power armoured factions, but not so far ahead as they were. Finally, Necrons, Orks and Demons, all via a mission, could certainly have used some buffs in one form or another, particularly if things like Marines, Guards and Sisters were getting some interesting changes. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of discussion around the subject. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. Outside from the new and very scary looking Tyranids, which are the other factions that you think is really going to be tearing it up after these changes? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. I do try and keep up with Games Workshop's news and releases as they happen. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all the 40k content does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.